Welcome to Reading Bear. Today we've got a story where OP bought their dream vacation cabin, but when their entitled parents found out, they listed it on Airbnb without permission. Let me tell you about the most insane thing my parents ever did, and how their entitlement came back to bite them so hard they're probably still feeling it. For some background, I'm in my early 30s and work in tech. I've been grinding for years, living below my means, saving every penny I could. My parents, on the other hand, have always been the type to spend money they don't have on things they don't need. They're constantly in debt, always asking family members for loans they never pay back, and somehow they think everyone owes them something just because they're older. About 2 years ago, I finally saved up enough to buy a small vacation cabin up in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with basic amenities, but it was mine. I'd been looking at real estate in that area for months, and when this place came on the market at a decent price, I jumped on it. The whole process took about 3 months from making the offer to closing, and I kept it completely quiet from my family because I knew they'd have opinions. The cabin sits on about half an acre of wooded land, about 2 hours from the city where I live. It's got a stone fireplace, a decent kitchen, and a wraparound porch that looks out over the forest. Nothing spectacular, but it was perfect for weekend getaways, and maybe some rental income down the line. I spent the first few months after buying it just fixing it up. New paint, some furniture, basic maintenance stuff that had been neglected by the previous owners. I managed to keep the cabin secret for almost 6 months. I tell people I was going hiking or camping when I went up there for weekends. But then my cousin saw photos I posted on social media of the view from the porch, and she recognized the area because her boyfriend's family has a place nearby. She mentioned it to my aunt, who of course told my mother, and within 24 hours, my phone was ringing off the hook. My mother's first words when I answered were not congratulations or questions about how I managed to save up for it. Instead, she launched straight into how hurt and betrayed she felt that I hadn't told the family about such a big purchase. She went on for about 10 minutes about how family should share everything and support each other, and how selfish it was of me to keep something like this to myself. Then came the demands. She wanted to know when the family could use it. She started talking about holiday gatherings, summer vacations, and how nice it would be for my father to have somewhere quiet to go fishing. She mentioned that my brother's kids would love to experience the outdoors, and how this could be such a wonderful gift to the whole family. I tried to explain that I bought the cabin as an investment and personal retreat. I told her I was planning to rent it out some weekends to help cover the mortgage and maintenance costs. I mentioned that I'd spent months researching the area and the purchase, saved for years to make it happen, and that I needed to be careful about how it was used to protect my investment. Her response was immediate and predictable. I was being selfish. I was forgetting where I came from. Family should come first. The usual guilt trip that she'd been using on me since I was a teenager. I tried to compromise. I told her the family could use the cabin sometimes, but I'd need advance notice, and there would have to be some ground rules about cleaning up, no smoking inside, no parties, that kind of thing. Basic stuff that any reasonable person would understand when borrowing someone else's property. But my mother wasn't interested in reasonable. She wanted unrestricted access whenever anyone in the family felt like using it. She suggested I should just give her and my father keys so they could coordinate family usage themselves. When I hesitated, she started in about how disappointing I'd become, how money had changed me, and how my grandparents would be ashamed of my attitude toward family. My father got on the phone and backed her up. He said they weren't asking for much, just the right to use their son's cabin when they needed to get away from things. He mentioned that they'd helped raise me and supported me through college, so the least I could do was share what I'd earned. I held my ground, but agreed that we could work something out where they could use the cabin occasionally with advance planning. I thought that was the end of it. I was very wrong. The next weekend, I drove up to the cabin planning to do some work on the deck railing. When I pulled into the driveway, there were 2 cars I didn't recognize parked there. I could hear voices and music coming from inside. My first thought was that someone had broken in, so I called the police before approaching the house. Turns out my parents had given keys to my aunt and uncle, who were up there with their adult children and some friends for an impromptu weekend party. They'd broken my no-smoking rule, left food out that had attracted animals, and somehow managed to clog the septic system. The police told me it was a family matter since my parents had keys, but I was furious. When I called my parents, my mother acted like I was being ridiculous for being upset. She said family should be able to use family property, and that my aunt and uncle had just needed a place to unwind. She brushed off my concerns about the damage and the mess, telling me that's just what happens when people actually live in a place instead of treating it like a museum. That's when I realized my parents had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. They thought that because I was their son, my property was somehow family property. They'd already started treating the cabin like it belonged to all of us, not just me. Over the next month, this happened 3 more times. Family members would show up at the cabin without asking me, sometimes when I was planning to be there myself. I'd arrive to find the place occupied, or I'd find evidence that people had been there without cleaning up properly. My cousin brought her dogs without asking, and they chewed up some furniture. My brother's teenagers had a party that resulted in some minor property damage. Each time I complained to my parents, they minimized the issues and made me feel like I was being unreasonable. They started saying things like I'd become too good for the family, that I was acting like I was better than everyone else, and that I needed to remember that family comes before money. The breaking point came when I found out they'd been telling people that the cabin belonged to the whole family, and that I was just the one who handled the paperwork and finances. They were actively encouraging relatives to use it whenever they wanted, and they were making plans for a big family reunion there without consulting me at all. I decided I needed to set some serious boundaries. I changed the locks and told my parents that family members would need to go through me directly to arrange stays at the cabin. I said I was happy to share it sometimes, but there had to be respect for my property and my rules. My mother's reaction was explosive. She screamed at me over the phone about how ungrateful and selfish I was. She said I was destroying the family over a stupid cabin and that I was being completely unreasonable. She demanded that I give her new keys immediately and stop treating family like strangers. When I refused, she told me that if I was going to act like the cabin was just a business property instead of a family asset, then maybe it should be treated like one. She said maybe I needed to learn what it was really like to run a rental business. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I found out soon enough. 2 weeks later, I got a call from someone asking about cabin availability for the following weekend. They said they'd seen the listing on Airbnb and wanted to confirm some details about the property. I was confused because I hadn't listed the cabin anywhere yet. I went online and searched, and sure enough, there was my cabin listed on Airbnb. The photos were ones my mother had taken from my social media posts, and the description was full of inaccuracies. The listing claimed the cabin slept 8 people, had a hot tub, was pet-friendly, and was available year-round. None of those things were true. The listing was under my parents' names, and they were charging significantly less than what comparable properties in the area were going for. They'd already accepted bookings for the next 3 months, including several weeks when I'd been planning to use the cabin myself. I called my mother immediately. She was completely unapologetic. She said that since I wanted to treat the cabin like a business property instead of sharing it with family, she'd help me get started in the rental business. She claimed she was doing me a favor by setting up the listing and getting bookings lined up. When I told her she had no right to list my property without permission, she said that she was just trying to help me see what real rental management looked like. She pointed out that I'd been talking about eventually renting the place out anyway, so she was just getting me started. I told her to cancel all the bookings and take down the listing immediately. Her response was that she'd already confirmed several reservations, and it would be wrong to cancel on people who were counting on their vacation plans. She said that if I wanted to be in the rental business, I needed to learn to honor my commitments to guests. That's when she said the thing that set up my malicious compliance. She told me that since I was so concerned about treating the cabin like a real business instead of a family property, then I needed to start acting like a real business owner. She said real business owners don't just cancel bookings because they change their minds. She said if I wanted to be professional about the cabin, then I needed to be professional about honoring the commitments she'd made on my behalf. She basically dared me to either admit the cabin was family property that everyone could use freely, or commit to running it like a real business and honor all the bookings she'd made. I was furious. But then I realized she'd just given me the perfect opportunity for malicious compliance. She wanted me to treat the cabin like a real business? Fine. I'd treat it exactly like a real business. First, I contacted a lawyer to understand my legal position. Turns out that listing someone else's property without permission could potentially be fraud, especially if money changed hands. My parents had essentially been operating an unlicensed bed and breakfast using my property as collateral. But instead of immediately pursuing legal action, I decided to play along with their game first. I called my mother back and told her she was absolutely right. If I was going to be in the rental business, I needed to be professional about it. I said I'd honor the bookings she'd made, but that since this was now a business operation, everything would need to be handled properly. I told her that as the property owner, I'd be taking over management of the listing and all guest communications. I said that since she'd positioned herself as the booking agent, she'd be responsible for guest services and cleaning between rentals. She seemed pleased that I was finally seeing things her way. Then I explained what being professional really meant. First, I'd need to charge her a management fee for taking over her bookings. Since property management companies typically charge 15–25% of rental income, I'd be charging her 20% of all the booking fees for my services. Second, since she was acting as the cleaning and maintenance service, I'd need her to provide those services at market rates. I researched local cleaning services and found that they charged about $200 per turnover for a property that size. I'd need her to clean the cabin between every guest stay, document the condition with photos, and report any damages or maintenance needs. Third, since this was now a business operation, all family members would need to book stays through the normal rental system and pay the going rate. No more free stays or informal arrangements. Fourth, any damages or issues caused by guests would be her responsibility to handle and pay for, since she was the one who had screened and approved the guests. Finally, since she'd made commitments about amenities that didn't exist, like the hot tub and pet-friendly policy, she'd need to either provide those amenities or handle the guest complaints when people arrived expecting things that weren't there. My mother started to object, saying that wasn't what she meant and that I was being ridiculous. But I reminded her that she was the one who insisted I needed to be professional about the rental business. I was just following her advice about how to run things properly. She tried to backtrack, saying she'd just been trying to help and that maybe we should cancel the bookings after all. But I told her she was right, that real business owners don't cancel confirmed bookings. Since she'd made the commitment to these guests, we needed to honor it. Over the next few weeks, the situation got increasingly chaotic. The first guests arrived expecting a hot tub that didn't exist. My mother had to field those complaints and offer a partial refund. The second group brought pets based on her listing description, and she had to scramble to make the place actually pet-friendly before they arrived. She was driving up to the cabin twice a week to clean between guests, which was a 4-hour round trip for her. The cleaning fee I was charging her was cutting significantly into any profit from the rentals, and she was starting to realize how much work was actually involved in managing a rental property. Then there were the problem guests. Since my parents had set the rental rate well below market value to attract bookings, they'd ended up with some questionable renters. One group left the place trashed and damaged some furniture. Another group had a loud party that resulted in noise complaints from neighbors. A third group tried to bring more people than the cabin could legally accommodate. Each incident meant my mother had to drive up to deal with the situation, arrange for repairs or cleaning, and handle upset neighbors or local authorities. She was spending more on gas, cleaning supplies, and minor repairs than she was making from the rental income after paying my management fee. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything carefully. Every text message, every email, every complaint, every expense. I was building a comprehensive record of the unauthorized use of my property and the problems it was causing. The breaking point came when one group of renters caused significant damage to the septic system and left the place in such bad condition that it wasn't habitable for the next scheduled guests. My mother had to pay for emergency septic repair and professional cleaning, plus refund the next group's booking because the place wasn't ready. She called me in tears, saying this was all getting out of hand, and couldn't we just go back to the way things were before? She said she'd learned her lesson about the rental business and just wanted things to be normal again. I told her I was just following her instructions about being professional in the rental business. I reminded her that she'd been the one to insist that I needed to honor the commitments she'd made and treat the cabin like a real business. That's when she finally broke down and admitted that listing my cabin without permission had been wrong. She said she'd just been frustrated about the family access situation and had acted impulsively. She begged me to cancel the remaining bookings and take down the listing, but I wasn't done yet. I told her that as a professional property manager, I'd identified several serious issues with her business practices that needed to be addressed. I discovered that she hadn't been collecting or remitting the proper taxes on rental income, which could result in penalties from both state and federal authorities. She also hadn't obtained the necessary business licenses or permits required for short-term rental operations in that jurisdiction. I explained that as the property owner, I could potentially be held liable for these oversights, so I'd need her to resolve all the legal and tax issues before I could continue working with her. I also mentioned that I'd been reviewing the guest communications and discovered several instances where she'd made promises about the property that constituted false advertising. Guests had been told about amenities and features that didn't exist, which could potentially result in legal action against both of us. Finally, I told her that the property damage and excessive wear from the high turnover of rental guests had decreased the value of my investment, and I'd need her to compensate me for that loss. By this point, my mother was completely overwhelmed. She'd gone from thinking she was doing me a favor to facing potential legal and financial consequences she'd never considered. The rental income wasn't nearly enough to cover all the expenses and complications she'd created. She begged me to just take over everything and make it all go away. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I told her I'd handle canceling the remaining bookings and taking down the listing, but there would be consequences for the unauthorized use of my property. I'd be filing a complaint with Airbnb about the fraudulent listing, and I'd be reporting the tax and licensing issues to the appropriate authorities. I also told her that, going forward, any family use of the cabin would be strictly by advance arrangement with me, and there would be a security deposit required to ensure the property was left in good condition. My father tried to intervene, saying I was being too harsh and that family should forgive family mistakes. But I pointed out that they were the ones who had insisted on treating the cabin like a business rather than family property. I was just following through on their approach. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Airbnb suspended my parents' account for listing property they didn't own. The local authorities fined them for operating an unlicensed short-term rental business. They had to pay back taxes on the rental income, plus penalties for not reporting it properly. The total cost to them ended up being several $1,000s, way more than they'd ever made from the rental bookings. But the real consequence was that they'd completely lost their credibility with the rest of the family. Word got around about what they'd done, and other family members were horrified that they'd listed someone else's property without permission. Several relatives who had been expecting to use the cabin for planned trips were upset that their reservations had been canceled. My parents tried to paint me as the bad guy, but most of the family saw through that pretty quickly. They realized that if my parents would do something like this to me, they might pull similar stunts with other family members' property or belongings. The best part was that my mother's original complaint about me not sharing the cabin had completely backfired. Before she listed it on Airbnb, I'd been open to occasional family use with reasonable advance notice. But after the chaos she'd created, I implemented a strict policy that family members had to book and pay for stays just like anyone else. She'd turned what could have been informal family sharing into a rigid business relationship, exactly like she'd demanded. Several months later, after all the legal and financial mess was sorted out, my mother finally approached me with something resembling an apology. She admitted that she'd acted impulsively and hadn't thought through the consequences. She said she'd learned that running a rental property was much more complicated and expensive than she'd realized. She asked if we could go back to the original arrangement where family could occasionally use the cabin with advance notice. I told her I'd consider it, but only if she agreed to some non-negotiable conditions. First, she'd have to pay for a comprehensive inspection and any necessary repairs to undo the damage from her rental operation. Second, she'd have to sign a written agreement acknowledging that the cabin was my property and that any use by family members was a privilege, not a right. Third, any family member who used the cabin would have to leave a security deposit and follow a detailed set of rules. She agreed to everything. It took almost a year, but eventually things settled into a new normal. My parents learned to respect my ownership of the cabin and to ask permission before making any assumptions about its use. Other family members saw what had happened and made sure to be respectful and appreciative when they wanted to use the place. I did eventually start renting the cabin out legitimately, but I did it properly with all the right licenses, insurance, and tax reporting. I learned a lot about property management from watching my mother's mistakes, so I was much better prepared when I started my own rental operation. The cabin has turned out to be a great investment, both financially and personally. I get to use it as my own retreat. It generates decent rental income, and occasionally family members get to enjoy it too. The difference is that now everyone understands and respects the boundaries around its use. Looking back, I think my parents learned more from their malicious compliance experiment than I did. They discovered that taking on responsibilities without understanding the work involved can be expensive and stressful. They learned that property ownership comes with legal and financial obligations that can't be ignored. Most importantly, they learned that trying to force someone to share something by taking it without permission is likely to result in losing access to it entirely. The whole experience actually improved my relationship with my parents in the long run. Once they accepted that I was an adult who could make my own decisions about my own property, we were able to interact more as equals rather than parent and child. They stopped trying to guilt-trip me into doing things their way, and I stopped having to defend every decision I made. And the cabin? It's still there, still generating income, still providing a peaceful retreat when I need to get away from everything. The only difference is that now everyone in the family understands that it's my property, managed according to my rules, and available to others only by invitation. Sometimes the best way to teach someone about boundaries is to let them experience the consequences of ignoring them. My parents wanted to treat my cabin like a business instead of family property, so I gave them exactly what they asked for. They learned very quickly that running a business involves a lot more responsibility and expense than they'd bargained for. The moral of the story? Be careful what you demand from others, because you might just get exactly what you ask for. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.